Long Beach is an LA location with a rich and storied history. Long before anybody named it Long Beach, this land was home to the Tongva people, a coastal community who lived off the ocean, inhabiting what would eventually be known as Long Beach along with nearby islands like Santa Catalina. They would live here for thousands of years, deeply connected to the land and sea, with their trade network reaching all the way to the Pacific Northwest and Mexico. But change was coming, as the explorers from the west, sailing under the Spanish crown, would finally begin to reach these faraway shores. When the explorer Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo first sailed the coast of California in the mid-1500s, he would arrive to the area now known as Long Beach, naming it the Bay of Smokes, as he likely observed the Native Americans' old way of sending smoke signals from the hill that's now called Signal Hill, along with numerous cooking fires of the Tongva, who had at least 3 major settlements within the current-day Long Beach. The Spaniards would eventually establish missions all over California, such as the Mission San Gabriel, founded by Catholic missionary Junipero Serra in 1771, now located in the city of San Gabriel near Los Angeles. The Spanish mission system would lead to forced relocation of the Tongva natives and their virtual enslavement, as well as the spreading of old world diseases that the natives had no immunity to, leading to high mortality and a rapid collapse of the Tongva society. Over time, what was once Tongva land transformed under Spanish, then Mexican, then American hands, and by the late 1800s, the settlers of this land had set the foundations for the city of Long Beach, named after a Los Angeles syndicate named Long Beach Land and Water Company, who would purchase the lands from a man named William E. Wilmore after he had failed to establish a farming community in the area named Wilmore City, which is why Long Beach still has a building and an entire neighborhood named after him. The city became first known as a seaside resort, with a popular waterfront amusement zone known as the Pike, but when oil was discovered on Signal Hill in the 1920s, the economy boomed, attracting fortune seekers and entrepreneurs in the area, which was further boosted by the founding of an even larger Wilmington oil field in the 1930s. In the early 1900s, African Americans began arriving in Long Beach during the first phase of the so-called Great Migration, as they escaped the deep-seated racism and discrimination in the southern states, plagued by the Jim Crow laws towards the northern states that were considered more progressive. Unfortunately, the Ku Klux Klan also had a presence in Long Beach, having had an annual meeting in the city and even a big parade. They would also allegedly successfully infiltrate the public offices of Long Beach, particularly the police department during the 1920s. Long Beach also has a deep-seated history of redlining, which is when the government literally outlined areas where Black Americans lived, deeming them as bad investment areas, as well as racial covenants which prevented Black Americans from purchasing houses in many white majority neighborhoods in the city. Therefore, the Black minority would largely end up living together in a few specific places, particularly in the so-called Central Area or Central District of Long Beach, which nowadays would be perhaps better known as the East Side. Their living area at the time roughly bounded by the Hill Street on the north, Cherry Avenue on the east, and 10th Street on the south, and Locust Avenue on the west, where the majority of the first Black residents of Long Beach would settle in. Looking at modern-day gang maps of Long Beach, it's also around this central area that the gangs would eventually begin forming and spreading out to all directions. Already during the 1920s and 30s, there were small criminal gangs operating around Long Beach, but these were seemingly largely white bandits, with some also seemingly being Mexican. But during the 40s, the African American population in Long Beach grew massively due to the so-called Second Great Migration of Black people from the South, who were still escaping the Jim Crow laws. And although the Black population in Long Beach would grow massively, they were still largely restricted to the same central area, making the area completely overcrowded. In 1940, the Carmelitos Public Housing Project was opened in North Long Beach to provide affordable housing for the quickly expanding population of the city, this being the Southern California's very first affordable housing complex. At the time, Carmelitos would host white families, but it would eventually become a majority Black community. And like most public housing projects, it would eventually become discarded by the authorities and taken over by the gangs. There's also a considerable Polynesian community in Long Beach, particularly Samoan, as a part of Samoa called American Samoa is actually a territory of the United States, and the citizens there are allowed to join the US military, which is how many ended up in Long Beach that had the large naval base, as can be seen from this 1959 news article about the Samoan Congregational Church of Long Beach, a community which has lived in the city for decades now. Still, coming into the 60s, a news article would state that Black people could only find housing in 2 Long Beach areas, one being the same central area of North 10th Street where the Black residents of Long Beach had first settled, and which one news reporter would visit in 1965, describing the area as similar to southern slums, where the houses behind the houses back up against the alleys that have never been paved and the ruts of automobile tires fill up with water when it rains. The other area where Black people were welcomed was a mixed neighborhood in the west side of Long Beach, south of Willow Street and west of the LA River, this area eventually also becoming home to many gangs. The 60s was the time of the civil rights movement, when Black people all over America would concurrently band together to fight against their decades-long segregation and discrimination, and this would also be the case in Long Beach, where Joseph Brooks, the president of the Long Beach chapter of the NAACP, would be one of the people leading the way. The 60s would also be a turbulent time, and in 1965 the Watts Riots, or the Watts Rebellion as it's also sometimes called, would hit the LA County. Caused by years of escalating tension between the police and the Black community around the county, emotions would finally boil over that summer, and what would start as rioting in the city of Watts would soon spread to other parts of LA County, including Long Beach in the south, where one policeman would end up dying as another shotgun shotgun would allegedly accidentally discharge as he was fighting off attackers. But overall, the great majority of the 34 people who would end up dying during the riot were actually black people. Between 1960 and 1970, the black population of Long Beach would double, now making about 5% of the city's population. From 1975, also a significant number of Cambodian refugees would arrive to Long Beach to escape the Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement that ruled Cambodia between 75 and 79. In 1983, a newspaper article would highlight how Long Beach had the largest Cambodian population of any city outside Cambodia. This population also largely living near the central area of the city, this neighborhood being eventually named officially as Cambodia Town. But the main topic of the article would unfortunately be how these refugees had largely struggled to integrate into society in Long Beach, and in later years many Asian gangs would also begin to form in Long Beach too. It was during the 70s that the gang problem truly began to manifest itself in the city, and in 1973 the Long Beach police would form a squad specializing in youth gangs, and they would even keep a file on the most hardened juvenile delinquents. The newspapers would still rarely name the gangs operating in the city, but one such gang would seemingly go by the Longos, a Hispanic gang that now controls large sections of Long Beach. However, what is clear is that also the Crips, who had begun operating in Los Angeles in the late 60s, would eventually migrate to Long Beach and make a major presence there too. And in 1983, the Los Angeles Times would write a long report about the gang problem in the Long Beach Polytechnic High School, better known as Poly High, which is located in the central area of Long Beach. The article would mention how there were several gangs present in the school, including Samoan gangs, two Longos gangs, the West Side and East Side Longos, as well as a Crip set known as the Insane Crips. At the end of 1985, the LA Times would also publish a report where they would highlight some of the hotspots of gang activity in the city, these unsurprisingly being particularly the two ghettos where the city had effectively pushed and overcrowded all their minorities during the previous decades, the so-called Central Area and the West Side. The article would also list the 7 largest gangs of Long Beach, these being the East Side Longos, which according to the newspaper was about 600 members deep at the time and the largest gang in the city, the West Side Longos, who according to the paper had previously been the largest gang in the city and a mortal enemy of the East Side Longos. Then there was the Insane Crips, who were reportedly the largest black gang in the city with around 450 members, their ops at the time allegedly being other black gangs from nearby cities of Compton and Wilmington. You have the Boulevard Boy Crips, who hailed from the area known as the DMZ, this area being in North Long Beach near the border of the city of Compton. Then there was the Sons of Samoa, which was reportedly made out of members of Samoan descent who were scattered all over the city. Then you've got the Pario Pobre, a Latino gang that had spread to Long Beach from the nearby city of Carson, and the Toca Town Flats, another Latino gang who were allied with the Barrio Pobre and rivals with both the Longos, their hood at the time allegedly being near the Drake Park. In 1987, the city would seemingly finally begin to react to the gang problem, introducing new anti-gang initiatives, such as Long Beach Unified School District's course called Alternatives to Gang Membership. The city was also planning on adding personnel to its gang unit, which at the time was only 2 officers strong. Newspapers would continue to report on the gangs throughout the 80s. One article from 1988 showing how the large gangs from the East Side Longos had formed numerous small cliques within the gang, one of these being called the Playboys, while another was called the Malditos. Coming into the 90s, violent crime in Long Beach was reaching its peak, much like in other major cities all over America, pushed by the crack epidemic. In 1992, the city would launch a new gang unit that aimed to combat the gang crime by handling all crimes that were believed to involve gang members through this one unit. The article would also mention how the city now had around 10,000 gang members, making about 2% of the city's population at the time. These were very wild times, but fortunately, it wasn't only gangs and their crimes that were causing headlines, as there was arguably a more positive movement growing in the streets of Long Beach. In the early 90s, a trio made out of a producer and rapper, another rapper and a singer began circulating their mixtapes all over the hoods of LA County, this trio being none other than Warren G, Snoop Dogg and the late Nate Dogg, who went collectively by the name 213, with this actually being the telephone area code of Long Beach at the time. Warren G would later tell during an interview with Rolling Stone how they were inspired by an Oakland-based rap group called 415. Warren G's stepbrother was none other than Dr. Dre, and one day during a bachelor party, Warren would play 213's demo tape to Dre, who would immediately invite the trio to record at his studio. This historical collaboration would eventually lead to numerous classic albums, including Dr. Dre's 1992 debut solo album The Chronic, Snoop Dogg's 94 debut album Doggy Style, Warren G's 94 debut album Regulate, G-Funk Era, which included the song Regulate with Nate Dogg, and numerous other hip-hop classics which played an instrumental role in forming the G-Funk or gangster funk style of gangster rap, which would become the definition of West Coast gangster rap for years to come. Other rappers from Long Beach were also part of the rising movement, such as Snoop Dogg's cousin Daz Dillinger, who would form the group The Dog Pound together with the rapper Corrupt, and the group The Eastsiders, which included the rappers Trey D and Goldie Loke, as well as Snoop Dogg, the group being named after all 4 being from the east side of Long Beach. The Eastsiders were also signed to Snoop Dogg's Doggy Style Records, releasing their debut album Snoop Dogg Presents the Eastsiders in February 2000. Local newspapers would report about the rise of these new G-Funk artists, one headline stating how Songs of Violence had topped the charts. But meanwhile, these same newspapers would also report how some Long Beach gangs had actually struck successful peace treaties in the streets. This particular LA Times article actually highlighted a peace treaty between Latino and Asian gangs of Long Beach. Newspapers would keep reporting about the gangs occasionally, and particularly the Insane Crips would be mentioned in numerous articles, with one 2004 article about a 10-year-old girl who was having to grow grow up in the middle of the gangland of the central area would describe the Insane Crips as one of California's most notorious gangs. In 2007, the LA Times would report how several young girls had attacked 3 white women during an apparent hate crime, with at least one of these girls, a 13-year-old, apparently having an affiliation with the baby Insane Crips, this generally referring to the younger members of the Insane Crips. The following year, the LA Times would report how, during a large-scale investigation into the mob Piru blood set from Compton, the police had stopped a likely shootout between the Pirus and the Insane Crips from Long Beach. Later that year, they would report how the Insane Crips had gotten involved in identity theft, this showing perhaps the first signs of how scamming would eventually become one of the key ways for modern street gangs to make money. However, in 2012, over a dozen members of the baby Insane Crips were arrested and charged in relation to 13 shootings between 2009 and 2011, showing that this gang was also still getting involved in more traditional gang activities. Although later that same year, law enforcement would also arrest and charge numerous baby Insane Crip members for involvement in a tax fraud scam. In 2015, news would report how California's Attorney General at the time, Kamala Harris, and her office had charged over 30 members and associates of the Insane Crips during the investigation into the tax fraud scheme, which had allegedly allowed the Insane Crips to steal millions of dollars worth of tax returns, showing how the scamming was here to stay when it came to ways for modern gangs to make money. However, don't get it twisted, there are also many legal hustles that Long Beach natives take part in, as we'll later see in our vlog. But coming into the 2020s, local newspapers have seemingly somewhat lost interest into the gangs operating in Long Beach, but meanwhile, people on the internet have filled this position, with countless social media accounts, subreddits, and other pages covering the gang scene in Long Beach more than ever. Based on these sources, Long Beach is still largely controlled by the same gangs that have already been mentioned during this quick peek into the history. And although they've evolved throughout the years and taken slightly different names, as well as forming new alliances and rivalries, and the areas they control are still pretty much the same, with the so-called Central Area or East Side having gangs like the Rollin' 20s Crips, East Side Longos, the Asian Boys Crips, and the Tiny Rascal Gang, which are both Asian majority gangs made up of youth particularly of Cambodian descent, and of course, the Insane Crips. While the West Side has gangs like the Rollin' 80s West Coast Neighborhood Crips, the Sons of Samoa, who are now called the Sons of Samoa Gangster Crips, and the West Side Longos. In North Beach, the Carmelitos large public housing project is nowadays the turf of a gang called the Brick Boy Crips, while there are also other gangs nearby such as the North Side Longos. So, now that we know some of the basics about the history of Long Beach and its gangs, let's get back to the vlog.